In this video, we're going to talk about AICE History Paper 1 and specifically Question A. We're going to save Question B for another video. To start out, we're going to go in depth on Paper 1, specifically what Paper 1 looks like. Then we're going to transition into Question A. We're going to look at the rubric and your requirements for answering this question, and also give you some formatting tips to make sure that whenever the scorers are looking over your paper, that they can easily see that you have met all the rubric requirements. And then finally, we're going to wrap up with a few tips and tricks to make sure that you are getting the most possible points out of your paper. Your Paper 1 is your source analysis paper. You will have 1 hour to read over 4 sources and answer 2 questions on those sources. Now for right now, though there is talk of this changing in the future, your Paper 1 has one set major overall content strand that your information will come from. For instance, for the American option, your Paper 1 is always going to be about the origins of the Civil War. For international history, it's always going to be regarding peace and security following World War I. Typically has to do with the League of Nations. And finally, for European, it has to do with liberalism and nationalism in Italy and Germany. Now, what does change year to year is the subtopic that your Paper 1 will be about. What I mean for that is, for the American option, for instance, you know your Paper 1 is always going to come from the origins of the Civil War. However, what does change is which subtopic of the causes of the Civil War will your Paper 1 be about. For instance, you could have your paper be about the Missouri Compromise or the Lincoln-Douglas debates. That changes from year to year. Question A asks you to compare 2 sources. Now, whenever you read Question A, you need to do 2 things first. Number 1, identify which 2 sources you're supposed to be analyzing. If it's asking you to compare sources B and D, and you answer sources A and B, you're already set up to not pass this paper. So make sure you're reading about and answering for the correct sources. Secondly, you need to read over the question. It's not simply going to say, compare these 2 sources. It's going to ask you a question such as, to what extent do sources A and B agree with President Monroe's stance on the Missouri Compromise? So once you have your question in mind and your sources down, go ahead and read and tackle that question. Now, before you actually start writing, it's important to note what you actually have to do to pass this part of the test. So let's go ahead and pause now and take a look at the rubric.
All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at the rubric here. As you can see, you can get anywhere from 0 to 15 points on Question A. Now, if we start down at the bottom, we'll go ahead and break down each one of the levels, getting more into detail with levels 3 and 4. But first, we'll start with level 0. Basically, to get to level 0, you have to have either not written anything at all or just written garbage down on your paper that has absolutely nothing at all to do with the actual sources or anything to do with answering the question. And that's really all that needs to be said with the level 0. If you do that, you're getting 0 points on it. A level 1 is basically you're describing what the sources are just saying. You're not really getting into the meat of the question in any kind of way, basically just paraphrasing the content, saying this is what the sources say, and you're not really giving any kind of comparison at all. Although the rubric does say you might be making a comparison at the level of one is a letter and one is from a speech. That's not the kind of level of comparison that we're looking for here on Question A. Level 2 is where you're comparing views and identify similarities and or differences. That's the key phrase thing here is similarities and or differences. If you only write about how the 2 sources are similar or how the 2 sources are different, you're not going to get passing marks on this part of the test. You have to do both. So once again, if you only give similarities or differences, you're only going to fall into a level 2. Now, if you notice here, it does also have the word and here. So you might give some sort of comparison here, but it's a very shallow comparison and you're not really developing it. You might make a general overall statement saying that they agree on one aspect without giving any actual evidence of how the sources agree. And for level 2, that can give you anywhere from 4 to 7 points. And now on to level 3. Last January, I was in a training with the AICE program and who was actually a scorer of the AICE History Papers, and she was going over what the scorers are looking for each one of these papers, and she let us know that level 3 is actually in the passing range for each one of the history rubrics. So all you need to do, at minimum, now making sure this is bare minimum you need to be doing here, is getting a level 3 on each one of the rubrics. I highly caution against just shooting for a level 3, because I've heard students before that have said 3s or E's get degrees, but anybody I have known that has shot for a score level E on their ACE exam has inevitably always gotten a U without fail. It's never happened before that I've ever had a student who said they were going to shoot for an E that actually got an E or above. Please don't challenge that statement and try to be the first one. But moving on, so level 3. All you have to do here for level 3 is basically write 2 paragraphs. You need to say how the sources are similar in one paragraph with specific textual evidence from both sources, and also say what the differences are. Also one paragraph for the differences with specific evidence from the sources. Now, if you're doing a good job here and very well developing a similarity and a difference here, you only have to give one of each. So you just have to say one way that the sources are alike and one way that the sources are different, as long as you're providing that evidence directly from the sources and are thoroughly developing the thought. And you can fall into the level 3 range here, which is 8 to 11 points. Now on to level 4. Level 4 is where you can get the biggest possible points here on this rubric. This is where you get basically a third paragraph or making your developed comparison. So for level 4, you still give that one paragraph on a similarity, one paragraph with a difference that are very well developed and given textual evidence, and finally a third paragraph, which I would say almost basically directly answers the question in the prompt usually, where you're essentially taking a stance. They usually say to what extent or overall, and then give you a question about to what extent do the sources agree on, well, I'll go back to this example from earlier, to what extent do the sources agree about President Monroe's stance on the Missouri Compromise. Here, basically, you would be stating overall the sources agree with whatever's in the prompt, and then give me evidence, specifically stating that the sources agree more than they disagree, or vice versa, giving direct evidence that the sources disagree more than they agree, or that they are more different than they are similar. If you do that, you will get in this level 4 range, and that is 12 to 15 possible points. And that sets you well on your way for passing your ACE exam overall. Typically, your ACE exam overall, you need to score, comfortable range would be 35 at minimum, should secure you an E. So getting anywhere from 12 to 15 points on paper 1 question A will set you up very nicely to get that passing score on your ACE exam.
Now, there's no set formatting requirements for any of the AICE history papers. However, I'm going to give you some ideas for each one of these videos I do on the actual writing of the papers on how you should format these. And trust me on these, format it this way. Remember, these are people reading these papers, and they have to read hundreds of these. So make sure that your paper stands out as doing exactly what you're supposed to be doing for the rubric. Don't worry about standing out as being different and catching their interest. That's not important. What's important here is that you're following the rubric. And you can actually make it very obvious you're doing that through your writing. Now, before I go into specifics about how to format your question A here, I want to just give you this one piece of advice for all of your AICE history papers, and that is to absolutely never write an introductory paragraph. It's completely unnecessary, and in fact, it wastes time. Like I said, you only have an hour for paper 1, and that's really not enough time. If you waste 3 to 5 minutes writing an introductory paragraphs for both of these questions, you've wasted way too much time. So, for question A, you're formatting. You need 3 paragraphs. One of these paragraphs needs to be on the similarities, or in other words, how these 2 sources agree. So you would state what these 2 sources agree on or how they are alike, and then provide evidence from both sources. That's very important here. You need to provide specific evidence from both of the sources. Your second paragraph needs to be about how these sources are different or how they disagree. Once again here, you need to have specific evidence from both of the sources. Don't forget that. If you don't have that specific evidence, you're not truly fully evaluating and going over these sources. So you might lose a couple points here or there. And finally, your third paragraph. Your third paragraph is where I would say you actually kind of answer the question in the prompt. This is where you state overall, do these sources agree or disagree? Or overall, are they more alike or more different? So here you once again, I would actually open this one up with a general statement such as overall, the sources agree with President Monroe's stance on the Missouri Compromise. Then tell me why they agree more. And that's giving me specific evidence once again from both of the sources. So to recap the formatting here, one paragraph on how the sources are alike or how they agree with specific evidence from both sources, a second paragraph with saying how they agree or, how they disagree or how they are different, and once again, with the evidence from both sources. And your third paragraph covers overall, do the sources agree or disagree with whatever the statement and the prompt is? And as always, you have to have that specific evidence from both sources. All right, and finally, we're going to discuss some tips and things to remember for answering paper 1 or question A specifically. So in general, for paper 1, the biggest issue here is time. 1 hour really isn't enough time to answer these questions. So you need to make sure you're watching the clock here and actually go ahead and set some pacing times for yourself. I would give yourself 10 minutes to read over and really take notes on each of the 4 sources. 10 minutes maximum. Then give yourself maximum 20 minutes, anywhere from 15 to 20 minutes to answer question A. And then give the rest of your time to B. Because when you actually look at both of the rubrics for question A and question B is where you get your most points, and it actually is the most time-consuming one of the papers. So you need to make sure you're giving yourself approximately 25 to 35 minutes to answer question B for this paper. Other tips in general, you need to once again make sure that you are giving textual evidence for each one of your paragraphs. I know I've said that a few times, but I really want to hammer that in. You have to make sure that you get evidence from both sources for all 3 of your paragraphs for your question A. So that's it for paper 1, question A. Check back soon for more videos on other AICE history papers.